Jessica and Todd Miller had what seemed like the perfect life. Living in a comfortable suburban home in the quiet town of Fairfield, Ohio, they embodied the American dream. Todd was a successful financial advisor, always impeccably dressed and charming to everyone he met. Jessica, on the other hand, was a beloved high school teacher, adored by students and respected by her peers. They had been married for 10 years, and while their relationship seemed solid from the outside, cracks were beginning to form under the surface. Jessica had noticed Todd becoming more distant over the last few months. His late nights at the office were becoming more frequent, and their once warm and loving relationship had grown cold. At first, she had brushed it off, attributing it to the pressures of work or maybe even a midlife crisis. But her suspicions began to grow when he became secretive with his phone, taking calls outside and texting late into the night. Jessica's best friend, Amber Caldwell, was the only person she confided in. They had been inseparable since college, sharing everything from career struggles to intimate details about their personal lives. Amber had been there through it all, every milestone, every tear, and every joy. So, naturally, Jessica turned to her for advice about Todd's unusual behavior. Amber listened intently, offering support and reassurance. She told Jessica not to jump to conclusions and to try talking to Todd. But in reality, Amber already knew exactly what was going on. She was the one Todd was texting late at night. She was the reason for his late nights at the office. What Jessica didn't know was that her two most trusted people, the love of her life, and her best friend, were betraying her in the most unimaginable way. It wasn't long before Jessica's suspicions became too great to ignore. She decided to take matters into her own hands. One evening after Todd had rushed out the door with another flimsy excuse, Jessica followed him. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she tailed his car through the winding streets of Fairfield, her heart racing with every mile. Eventually, Todd's car turned into the parking lot of a familiar apartment complex. Amber's apartment complex. Jessica's stomach churned with a sickening realization. She sat in her car for what felt like an eternity, watching as Todd entered Amber's building. Any remaining doubt vanished. The two people she trusted most had been carrying on an affair behind her back. When Todd finally left hours later, Jessica didn't confront him. Instead, she went home, her mind reeling with rage, hurt, and betrayal. She felt numb, unable to process the depth of their deception. But as the days passed, her anger grew, festering into something far darker. Jessica became cold and calculating. She could have confronted them, demanded answers, or even filed for divorce, but that wasn't enough for her. They had shattered her world, and she would make them both pay for it. Her plan began to take shape one evening as she prepared dinner. The clinking of the wine glasses, the soft simmer of the sauce on the stove, it all seemed so normal, so routine. But at this time, the meal she would prepare would be their last. Jessica knew she had to be meticulous. If she was going to carry out her plan, it couldn't appear suspicious. She spent weeks researching poisons, scouring the internet late into the night for the perfect method. Something undetectable. Something that would make their death seem like an unfortunate accident. That's when she discovered aconite, an ancient poison, almost impossible to trace if administered correctly. Aconite, or the queen of poisons, could cause symptoms similar to a heart attack or severe food poisoning. Its effects were fast and deadly, leaving victims gasping for air as their organs slowly shut down. Jessica was confident it would do the job perfectly. Once she had the poison in her possession, Jessica waited for the right opportunity. It came sooner than she expected. Todd, perhaps feeling guilty about his betrayal, had suggested that they invite Amber over for dinner. Jessica had to suppress her rage at the suggestion, but she played her part well, smiling and agreeing that a dinner with Amber would be nice. The perfect chance for the two of them to let their guard down, she thought. On the night of the dinner, Jessica cooked a lavish meal. She carefully prepared each dish, taking extra care with the wine and dessert. The aconite, in its powdered form, was nearly invisible as she stirred it into the dessert sauce. She made sure the portions for Todd and Amber were generous, ensuring they would each receive a fatal dose. For herself, she made a separate plate, untainted, innocent. As she set the table, her hands trembled with a strange mixture of anxiety and anticipation. She could already imagine them writhing in pain, their faces contorted in confusion as the life drained from their bodies. But she couldn't let her emotions show. Tonight she needed to be the perfect hostess. Amber arrived first, as usual, greeting Jessica with a warm smile and a hug. If Amber suspected anything was wrong, she didn't show it. Jessica offered her a glass of wine, and they chatted casually about their lives, work, and everything in between. But as they spoke, Jessica couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in Amber's demeanor, little things that confirmed what she already knew. The stolen glances, the nervous laughter, it was all there. Todd arrived shortly after, his usual charming self. He kissed Jessica on the cheek, as if nothing was amiss, then greeted Amber with a lingering hug. Jessica watched them closely, her smile thin, hiding the fury that burned just beneath the surface. She offered them both another glass of wine, keeping her distance as they drank. The night progressed as Jessica expected: polite conversation, laughter that didn't reach her eyes, and the shared meal that sealed their fate. As dessert was served, Jessica felt a strange calm wash over her. She watched as Todd and Amber dug into the rich chocolate mousse. The deadly sauce mixed in so perfectly that neither noticed a thing. They both complimented her on the meal, thanking her for the wonderful evening. The very idea made Jessica sick, but she kept up her facade, nodding and smiling, all the while counting down the minutes in her head. It didn't take long for the poison to begin its deadly work. Amber was the first to feel it. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, bringing a hand to her stomach as a wave of nausea hit her. She let out a small, embarrassed laugh, blaming the rich food, but her face had already begun to pale. "I think I might need some air," Amber muttered, rising shakily from the table. She only made it a few steps before collapsing to her knees, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Todd rushed to her side, his expression filled with confusion and panic. "Amber? Amber, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice rising in fear. But even as he spoke, Todd's own body betrayed him. His hands shook and sweat beaded on his forehead. His vision blurred as he tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him, sending him crashing to the floor next to Amber. Jessica remained seated, watching the scene unfold with a chilling detachment. Todd's eyes met hers, filled with desperation and terror. He tried to speak, to call out for help, but his throat tightened as his body convulsed in agony. "What did you do?" Todd managed to choke out, his voice barely audible over the sound of his labored breathing. Jessica didn't respond immediately. She simply stood, taking her time as she moved toward them. She crouched down next to her husband, looking into his fading eyes, and finally spoke in a calm, icy voice. "Exactly what you deserve." The poison was working faster than Jessica had anticipated. Todd's face had turned a sickly shade of grey, his eyes wide with terror as his body continued to seize. Amber lay next to him, her breathing shallow and erratic, clutching her stomach as her muscles twitched uncontrollably. Both of them were dying, and Jessica felt a dark satisfaction rising inside her as she watched them suffer. Todd tried to reach out, his trembling hand grasping at nothing as his body grew weaker. His lips parted, attempting to form words, but his throat had already begun to close. The look of betrayal in his eyes might have hurt Jessica once, but now it was only fuel for her twisted sense of justice. "I trusted you, Todd," Jessica whispered, her voice filled with a cold fury. "I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me? With lies, with her." Todd's eyes fluttered as he struggled to hold on, each breath more labored than the last. Amber, too, was slipping away. Her once beautiful face was contorted in pain, her chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. The vibrant woman who had been Jessica's closest friend for years was now a broken, dying figure on the floor, paying the ultimate price for her betrayal. As Todd's final moments approached, he tried one last time to reach out to Jessica, but his strength was gone. His body gave a final shudder before going limp, his eyes vacant and lifeless. He was gone. Jessica didn't flinch. She felt no pity, no remorse. Only a deep, cold satisfaction. Amber wasn't far behind, her body convulsing one last time before she, too, succumbed to the poison. The room was now eerily silent, save for the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. Jessica stood there for a long moment, staring at the two bodies sprawled on her pristine floor. She had done it. With Todd and Amber dead, Jessica's focus shifted to the next part of her plan, covering her tracks. She knew that poisoning could raise suspicions, but she had already thought of a way to make their deaths appear accidental. It was all part of the intricate web she had woven over the past weeks. Jessica calmly retrieved a pair of latex gloves from under the kitchen sink, slipping them on before moving around the house. She cleared away the wine glasses and dishes, wiping down every surface she had touched. The poisoned dessert, now half-eaten by Todd and Amber, was carefully disposed of along with the wine bottle. Every trace of the aconite-laced meal had to disappear. Next, she turned her attention to the bodies. It would be impossible to move them without attracting attention, so Jessica planned to make it look like they had died from a sudden illness, perhaps food poisoning, an unfortunate accident after a bad batch of seafood. She opened the window slightly, letting in the cool night air, hoping to mask any lingering scent of the poison. She grabbed her phone and, after a deep breath to calm her nerves, dialed 911. "I need help, my husband and my friend, and I'm not breathing." Jessica's voice was filled with well-practiced panic, her breath hitching as if she were on the verge of tears. "We had dinner, and they both just collapsed. Please send someone quickly." The dispatcher assured her that help was on the way. Jessica dropped the phone on the counter, her heart racing but not from fear. She knew she had set the stage perfectly. By the time the paramedics arrived, the scene would look exactly as she wanted it, to a tragic accident, a wife who had helplessly watched her husband and best friend die. Jessica walked back into the dining room, her eyes falling on the lifeless bodies of Todd and Amber one last time. She had won. The ultimate betrayal had been avenged, and no one would ever know the truth. As the sound of sirens echoed in the distance, Jessica wiped the last traces of sweat from her brow and sat down, waiting for the authorities to arrive. She would play the grieving widow, the devastated friend, but inside she felt nothing but the satisfaction of her carefully executed plan. When the paramedics arrived, the house was already eerily quiet. Jessica played her part to perfection. She stood at the doorway, trembling, her face pale and streaked with what appeared to be tears. The two bodies lay motionless on the dining room floor as the EMTs rushed past her, dropping to their knees beside Todd and Amber. Jessica clasped her hands to her mouth, forcing a sob as one of the paramedics checked for a pulse. She already knew the outcome, but she needed to sell the part. She needed to be the broken, devastated wife who had just lost everything in a horrible accident. The first paramedic shook his head, turning to his partner. "We've got 2 DOAs, he said grimly. "No signs of trauma, but their skin is cold. Rigor hasn't fully set in yet. It must have happened not too long ago." Jessica crumbled onto the couch, her body trembling as the words hit her, dead on arrival. It was exactly what she had expected, yet hearing it aloud sent a shiver down her spine. She let out a broken wail, hiding her face in her hands. "What happened here, Mom?" one of the paramedics asked, his voice soft and sympathetic. Jessica took a deep, shaky breath, keeping her voice fragile and full of emotion. "I don't know. We had dinner, everything was fine, but then Todd and Amber, her voice cracked, they started feeling sick. At first we thought it was just something minor, but then they collapsed. I didn't know what to do." The paramedic placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to comfort her. "We'll need to get some more information for the police and medical examiner," he said gently. "It could be food poisoning, like you said, but we need to run some tests to be sure." Jessica nodded, her tear-streaked face the picture of a grieving widow. She knew that medical exams would reveal no obvious cause of death. By the time they traced the poison, if they ever did, she would be in the clear. A grieving wife, tragically caught in the middle of an unforeseeable catastrophe. As the paramedics called in the police, Jessica excused herself, claiming she needed a moment to gather herself. She went to the bathroom, locking the door behind her. She looked in the mirror, staring at the reflection of the woman who had just killed 2 people. Her tears had dried, and her face, though still red from feigned crying, showed no sign of regret. She felt nothing but relief. The worst part was over. All that was left was to wait. The police arrived not long after, their flashing lights casting an ominous glow over the quiet street. Detective Ray Morris was the first on the scene, a seasoned investigator with sharp eyes and a gut instinct that rarely failed him. As he walked into the house, taking in the bodies on the floor and the sobbing woman on the couch, he couldn't help but feel that something wasn't right. Detective Morris surveyed the scene with a keen eye. He had been working homicide long enough to know that not every death was what it seemed. While the paramedics had written it off as a potential food poisoning case, something about it felt off. 2 adults, in good health, suddenly collapsing after dinner. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but he knew better than to take things at face value. "Mrs. Miller." Morris approached Jessica slowly, his tone gentle but probing. "I'm very sorry for your loss, but I need to ask you a few questions to understand what happened here." Jessica wiped her eyes, her voice still shaky as she nodded. "Of course. I'll help in any way I can." Morris took a seat across from her, pulling out a small notebook. "Can you walk me through the evening? What did you all have for dinner? When did they start feeling ill?" Jessica recounted the night with precision, describing the meal in detail, just as she had rehearsed. "We had some wine, a roast chicken, and a chocolate mousse for dessert. Everything seemed fine at first, but after dessert they started feeling sick. Amber said she felt nauseous, and then Todd complained of dizziness. It all happened so fast." Her voice trailed off, as if the memory was too painful to recount. Morris scribbled notes, watching her closely. Something about her didn't sit right with him. She was too calm, too collected, considering what had just happened. Most people were frantic, inconsolable in situations like this, but Jessica seemed composed. almost as if she had prepared for it. Did either of them mention feeling unwell before dinner? Morris pressed. No, Jessica replied quickly. They were both fine before. It wasn't until after the dessert that things went wrong. Horace raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The medical examiner would give him more answers, but his gut was already telling him this wasn't just a case of bad food. He glanced around the dining room, noting the spotless surfaces, the neatly arranged furniture. It all seemed too perfect, too staged. We'll be sending the bodies to the lab for an autopsy, Morris said, watching her reaction. It's standard procedure in cases like this, just to rule out any foul play. Jessica's face paled slightly, but she quickly composed herself, nodding in agreement. I understand. As Detective Morris stood to leave, he took one last look around. Something was definitely off, and he intended to find out what. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a tragic accident. Something darker lurked beneath the surface, and he was going to uncover it. Jessica watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. She had covered her tracks perfectly, hadn't she? The days following Todd and Amber's deaths were a blur of condolences, police interviews, and well-meaning neighbours bringing casseroles to Jessica's door. She played her role impeccably, grieving widow, heartbroken friend, shattered by the sudden loss of her husband and best friend. But behind closed doors, her mind raced. She hadn't anticipated the level of scrutiny the case would attract. While the initial reactions were focused on food poisoning, Detective Ray Morris wasn't letting it go that easily. His visits became more frequent, his questions more pointed. He wasn't accusing her of anything outright, but Jessica could tell he was suspicious. His eyes lingered too long on her every word, every movement, as if he were searching for cracks in her story. Morris had grown up in Fairfield. He knew the town, knew its people, and despite the outwardly calm demeanor Jessica projected, something about her wasn't sitting right with him. Her story was too smooth, too rehearsed. He had seen enough grieving spouses to know that most weren't nearly as composed in the aftermath of tragedy. Jessica was careful, though. She answered every question with precision, never hesitating, never stumbling. When Morris inquired about Todd's health, she mentioned a mild heart condition, something had been serious, but that could offer a convenient explanation if anyone pushed too hard on the medical side of things. But what Jessica didn't know was that the autopsy results were about to change everything. One afternoon, as she sat at her kitchen table, the phone rang. It was Detective Morris. His voice was calm, but Jessica could hear something unsettling beneath the surface. Mrs. Miller, I'd like you to come down to the station tomorrow. We have the preliminary results from the autopsy. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. She kept her voice steady. Of course. Did they find anything unusual? We'll discuss that when you get here, Morris said, his words careful, revealing nothing. After hanging up, Jessica felt the first real surge of panic since she had executed her plan. What had they found? Could the poison have been detected after all? She had researched aconite thoroughly. It was supposed to be almost impossible to trace, but doubt began creeping in, gnawing at her. That night, for the first time since Todd and Amber's deaths, Jessica didn't sleep. Instead, she sat awake, staring into the darkness, her mind racing with possibilities. If they had found traces of the poison, her whole world could unravel. Everything she had worked so meticulously to orchestrate could come crashing down. But she couldn't let that happen. The next morning, Jessica arrived at the Fairfield Police Department with her composure firmly in place. She had chosen her outfit carefully, nothing too formal, nothing too casual. She needed to appear as a grieving widow, but also as someone with nothing to hide. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirt, but she quickly hid them in her lap when Detective Morris entered the room. He sat down across from her, a file in his hand. His expression was unreadable, but Jessica could sense the shift. He wasn't here for another routine questioning. Thank you for coming in, Mrs. Miller, Morris began, his voice calm but firm. We've received the preliminary results from the medical examiner's office. Jessica nodded, forcing herself to remain calm. And, what did they find? Morris opened the file, flipping through the pages as if considering where to start. Initially, we thought it might have been food poisoning, but that didn't explain the severity of their symptoms. There was no evidence of bacterial toxins in either body. Jessica's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. The autopsy revealed something much more unusual, Morris continued, his eyes locking onto hers. Both Todd and Amber had traces of aconite in their systems. It's an incredibly rare toxin, almost undetectable unless you know what to look for. Jessica's blood ran cold. She had done everything right, researched every detail, planned meticulously. How could they have found it? I I don't understand, she stammered, trying to play the innocent victim. Aconite? What is that? How could they have been exposed to something like that? Morris leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. Aconite is a highly poisonous substance, historically used as a weapon in both murders and suicides. It's not something you find accidentally, Miss Miller. It's not found in food or household products. Someone had to administer it. Jessica's pulse quickened. She knew she had to think fast. Are you saying someone poisoned them? She asked, her voice rising in a mixture of fear and disbelief. Who would do such a thing? I loved my husband. Well, Morris didn't answer immediately. He closed the file, sitting back in his chair, watching her carefully. And that's what we're trying to figure out. We've been speaking with friends, colleagues, and neighbors. And there's something else we found. Jessica swallowed hard. Todd's phone. We recovered some deleted messages between him and Amber. Her heart pounded. She hadn't anticipated this. Todd and Amber had been sloppy, careless, leaving behind digital footprints. We know about the affair, Morris said bluntly, watching her reaction. We know they were planning to be together. So, I have to ask you, Mrs. Miller, did you know? Jessica's eyes filled with tears. Real this time, not the carefully orchestrated act she had maintained for weeks. She hadn't expected the affair to come to light so quickly, hadn't prepared for this kind of confrontation. She hesitated, her voice trembling. I knew, but I didn't. Morris cut her off. We'll be conducting a deeper investigation into the events leading up to their deaths. Given what we've found so far, we'll need to keep in touch. For now, you're free to go, but I strongly suggest you don't leave town. Jessica nodded weakly, her heart racing as she left the station. As she stepped out into the bright daylight, her carefully constructed world began to collapse around her. She thought she had planned for everything, but the walls were closing in. The truth was catching up to her faster than she had ever imagined. The walls were indeed closing in. Jessica's carefully orchestrated plan, the cold and calculated steps she had taken, were unraveling faster than she could control. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, Detective Ray Morris's investigation grew more intense. Forensic specialists combed through every detail of Todd and Amber's deaths, searching for any clue that would tie the aconite poisoning back to Jessica. She had thought she had covered her tracks, but it was becoming clear that her meticulous planning hadn't been enough. The affair between Todd and Amber gave motive, and with the poison found in their systems, the pieces were falling into place for the investigators. Still, Jessica had not been formally charged yet. She kept her head down, maintained her role as the devastated widow, but deep down, she knew her time was running out. One evening, Jessica received an unexpected call from Detective Morris. His tone was different this time. Not the probing, suspicious edge she had come to expect, but something more resigned, even cold. Mrs. Miller, he began, we've completed our investigation. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest. She held her breath, waiting for the inevitable accusation. So we have enough evidence to make an arrest. Jessica's grip tightened on the phone, her mind racing. It was over. She could hear it in his voice. After all the research, the planning, it had come down to this moment. They had figured it out. However, Morris continued, there's something I think you should know before we proceed. Jessica's pulse quickened. What do you mean? There was a pause on the line, and then Morris's voice returned, low and calculated. Amber didn't just betray you with Todd. She had been planning this for longer than you realized. Jessica frowned. What are you talking about? We found records in Amber's phone, Morris said slowly, as if savoring each word. Conversations between her and Todd discussing more than just their affair. They were planning to leave you behind. Yes, but Amber had other plans. She had been researching aconite too. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She had ordered the poison from an online supplier, Morris continued. We traced the purchase to her name. It looks like Amber had intended to poison Todd and pin it on you, possibly as a way to get you out of the picture once and for all. Jessica's mind spun. Amber, her best friend, the woman who had stolen husband, had been plotting to kill Todd all along. The plan had been for her to be the one who lost everything, framed for the murder of her husband. The betrayal ran even deeper than she had imagined. She just didn't get the chance to execute her plan, Morris said. It seems you beat her to it. Jessica couldn't speak. The room around her spun as the full weight of what had happened settled on her shoulders. She had spent weeks plotting the perfect revenge, poisoning the two people who had betrayed her. But the reality was that Amber had been just as cold and calculating. They had both been playing the same deadly game, and in the end, only one of them had won. I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Miller, Morse said after a pause. The prosecutor's office is prepared to offer you a deal. Given Amber's role in this and the overwhelming evidence against her, they're willing to pursue a lesser charge for you manslaughter instead of murder. If you cooperate, you might be able to avoid life in prison. Jessica sat down, the weight of it all pressing down on her. She had won, but at what cost? She had killed her husband, her best friend, and now she was staring down the possibility of spending years behind bars. The satisfaction of her revenge had long since faded, replaced by an empty, hollow feeling. There was no escape from the consequences of what she had done. "I'll take the deal," Jessica whispered into the phone, her voice devoid of emotion. Morris didn't respond immediately, but when he finally spoke, there was a trace of something like pity in his voice. "We'll make the arrangements. Someone will be by to pick you up tomorrow." As she hung up the phone, Jessica sat in silence, the events of the last few months playing over and over in her mind. Todd's betrayal, Amber's deception, the poison, the deaths, it all felt like a distant memory now. But the truth was, she had trapped herself in the same web of lies and deceit that she had sought to escape. The poison hadn't just taken Todd and Amber's lives, it had taken hers as well. The next morning, when the officers arrived to escort her to the station, Jessica didn't resist. She walked out of her house, the same house she had once shared with Todd, with her head held high. She had gotten her revenge, but in the end it had cost her everything. As the door to the squad car closed behind her, Jessica's eyes glazed over, staring out at the life she had destroyed. Her perfect plan had turned into the perfect tragedy. Justice, in the end, had been served, but not in the way she had ever expected.